So today's forum, Sustainable Cities, the Facts of the Matter, is presented in partnership with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, represented here by William Murdoch, and several of his team. Please join me in thanking Morpsey for helping us bring this forum together. Thank you. Last year, the Urban Solutions Program of the National Resource Defense Council, or NRDC, commissioned a major research report to study market trends, emerging housing preferences, and opportunities for redevelopment. We are very fortunate that Columbus was selected to be included in this study. Joining us from the national headquarters of the NRDC in Denver, Colorado, is Duran Lovis. Please help me in recognizing Duran. Our first speaker today, Dr. Arthur Chris Nelson, is Presidential Professor of City and Metropolitan Planning at the University of Utah, and the author of this study, who will premiere his results with us today. Joining Chris to discuss the study and its implications are Rachel Kleit, Head of City and Regional Planning Section at the Knowlton School at The Ohio State University, and our host and moderator, Lisa Patt-McDaniel, Director of Community Development, Ohio Capital Corporation of Ohio, and former head of Ohio Department of Development. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nelson and our panelists. Dr. Nelson, the podium is yours.
Thank you all very much. I'm delighted to be here. Although I live in Salt Lake City, which is 5,000 feet in the air, it is much colder here. So I was given about 4 hours to talk about my report, so I'll do that here momentarily. For the next 7 or so minutes, I'm going to go over the highlights of the report, but suffice it to say that Columbus, like the rest of the country, is going to undergo some very significant changes in demographics and economics over the next 30 to 40 years. The population of this part of the country, well, put it this way, but for Columbus, Ohio, the state of Ohio loses population between now and 2040. The Columbus metropolitan area will add about 500,000 people, while the state as a whole outside of Columbus will lose about 300,000. So you are the future of Ohio. In terms of, yes, absolutely. But your population is going to be changing very dramatically, as is the rest of the state and the country. Between now and 2040, about 44% of the net change in the population growth will be attributable to seniors, people like me turning 65. They will also dominate the housing market, and I suspect that seniors, when they move into the next stage of housing, before the final stage of housing, will probably want something different than what they have now. But the population is also changing in terms of race and ethnicity. Between now and 2040, roughly 94% of the total population growth in the Columbus area will be attributable to what I call the new majority. Now, the Census Bureau says by 2043 or thereabouts, the U.S. will be a country of majority-minority. And I can't get my arm around that term. So I say the new majority is where we're headed, and that is those are the formerly minority populations. So the Columbus metropolitan area's growth will be almost entirely attributable to the new majority. The number of households will also change in this area by about 55%. You'll add about 250,000 new households. But let me talk about who those households are going to be. So between now and 2040, only 20% of the net growth in households will have children in them. 80% won't. Now, we'll have more children in 2040 than now, and more households with children in 2040 than now, but their share of the total housing demand is only 20%. In contrast, 55% of the total net change in households will be comprised of single persons. 55% single person households will comprise the total household change between now and 2040, and that's mostly the baby boomers losing their partners along the way. Now let's talk a little bit about the kind of housing types I come up with. So I divide the world crudely up into starter households, those under 35, they want apartments and townhouses, condos, small homes, small lots. They're starting out in life. Then those over 65 are downsizing. They're unloading their larger home. They don't want to take care of the lot. And they'll actually start doing that around age 70. By age 70, that age group begins to unload their homes in very large numbers. In the middle, we have the households in their peak housing demand part of their life stage, those between 35 and 64. They've got children, they're working, they have good incomes, they want space, they need space, and they drive the economy when they dominate the economy. But they will not dominate the economy in the future. For example, between 1990 and 2010, that age group, the drivers of the larger homes and larger lots, were almost 80% of the total demand for new housing between 1990 and 2010 in Columbus, Ohio. That group will be 31% of the demand between now and 2040. Still more demand coming, but a whole lot less. Instead, the downsizing market will be 44% of the total next generation demand for housing. We're going to see some important changes in home ownership and renter rates. As the economy, as the state, as the metropolitan area moves more towards the new majority, we know that unfortunately the new majority households own homes at a much slower rate than the rest of than the white non-Hispanic households. That plus other factors tells me that that between 2010 and 2040, roughly 60% of the entire change in demand for housing will be for renters. 60% entire change will be assignable to renters. Now, we're not going to build apartments to meet all that demand. What's going to happen is that several tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of currently owner-occupied housing units will become occupied by renters. We need to think ahead for that. Now, this won't happen overnight. This is going to happen gradually, glacially, year over year over year to 2040. It won't be perceptible in a given year, but in 10 years, you'll see it. We also know from some recent survey research done by the National Association of Realtors that came out last year that roughly 40% of Ohio households and 40% of U.S. households, and I assume about 40% of Columbus households, would prefer to have the opportunity to live in some form of attached housing. Apartment, condo, townhouse, whatever it is, 40%. That's not so far off from what there is now, actually. Of the 60% that want the single-family detached option, most of them want the smaller lot option, which could be quarter acre or less, or thereabouts. So 35% of the entire preference package for housing in the future will be for smaller single-family lots, and the rest, 25%, will be for the larger lots. So we need to think ahead in terms of meeting those needs. Now, in terms of thinking ahead, you already have on the ground today more single-family homes on the larger lots than the total market needs by the year 2040. Now, you'll still build more homes on larger lots, and there's always going to be the niches that need to be satisfied. But on the whole, you have enough homes on larger lots today to satisfy your needs to the year 2040. Between now and 2040, however, roughly half of all new housing built, according to preference polls, will need to be in the attached modes, townhouse, condo, apartment, and the other half would be in the small lot category. You're also going to grow in your employment. You'll be adding about 435,000 jobs between now and 2040. You're growing by about 37%. But the really big opportunity, I think, that is presented here is that between now and 2040, you will build about 1.1 billion square feet of non-residential space. 1.1 billion square feet. 750 million square feet of that will be redevelopment of existing built spaces. And when I look around, I look at your data and so forth, it occurs to me that you can put all new jobs, all new multifamily attached housing products, and have all the redevelopment that you need to accommodate on existing parking lots through the metropolitan area. And that is my message. Thank you all very much.
I think we'll start by asking Rachel why don't you go ahead and start and comment so far on what you've heard.
I have three main issues that I want to raise about the information that we've heard. One of them has to do with this issue of what kind of development is already happening in the region and what kinds of demand there's going to be in the future. The second has to do with the attractiveness, the relative attractiveness of building in greenfields versus doing the kind of redevelopment that Chris is talking about. And the third has to do with the equity issues given the transformation of the population that we're going to see by 2040. So we see the kinds of infill that Chris is talking about already. We see it downtown, just around the corner here. We see it in the short north. We see Dublin's plans for a new town center. And we've also started planning transit to support it, the bus rapid transit going up Cleveland Avenue up to Dublin from downtown as a first step in creating the kind of future that I think we want to have as a metropolitan area. But it's happening unevenly, this development. And to make the most of this sea change in our population, it has to happen everywhere. And I just want to share something that I heard last night at dinner. A colleague of mine, another professor, asked his freshman and sophomore planning class whether when they got out of school they wanted to own a car. And out of 50 students in the class, how many do you think said when they got out of school they want to live somewhere where they could have a car and drive everywhere? 30%. One. Yeah, well, yeah, so that's a choice, right? Everybody or nobody, yeah. So that's, and those are the millennials, those freshmen. And so what will happen if we don't deal with these changes, that we're going to see a lot of abandonment in the suburbs because that housing stock is not going to be attractive to this new generation, to people who are either downsizing their homes because they're elderly or millennials who are living in smaller housing, in smaller households. So I guess I want to raise a question. I think Lisa will deal with this later as well, which is really how do we think about the role of the regional planning agency in this? In some areas, I lived in Seattle up until a year ago, very strong planning regime, growth management. If you down at the bottom of that regime in the local areas, you had to be in alignment with higher level plans. And here we do things very differently. We have a lot of negotiation about what we're doing. We have a lot of home rule. And I'm wondering what needs to happen either through public-private partnerships or is there legislation that has to happen? We need to have a conversation of some way facilitating a broader regional conversation so that we end up with a region in 2040 that looks the way we want it to look. And I want to tell you a little bit of a fable, not a fable. You all know Detroit, right? All right. I have a friend, my friend George Galster is at Wayne State University. He wrote a book called Driving Detroit. And in this book, he talks about the reason Detroit is hollowed out in the middle. And what he says is it's because Detroit is producing 20,000 more units of housing on the outskirts than it needs every year. And so people are buying new houses, they buy up every year, leaving the inner city abandoned. Now, we don't have that pattern, and I hope we never do. But I think we really need to think about whether we're going to build on these parking lots like Chris is talking about or continue to do the greenfield development. So that brings me to my second point. So what I've heard, and I've been here a year, so I'm still an observer, what I heard when I got here was that it was cheaper to build on greenfields than it was to do redevelopment in the inner city. And so after reading this report, I thought, well, what's gonna make it attractive? What's gonna make it financially viable for developers to change? Are we gonna have so much demand for attached housing? Are we gonna build a lot of senior housing? What is this gonna look like? And is that gonna push the market far enough to avoid the picture that Chris painted for me last night of abandonment in the suburbs? So he, in his report, has a lot of recommendations, changes to codes, form-based codes, planning overlays, thinking about what that market is going to be, planning for the current market with a future market in mind. But we need to think about that we have a sea change in demand that's going to happen in the next 40 years. So the last point I want to make is about the qualitative change in the population. Chris was talking about how the population growth over the next 40 years is going to be driven by what he's calling the new majority. And actually, we already have that happening in Columbus. Columbus is the only, I think Franklin County was the only county in the 2010 census that had population growth due to immigration. Between 2000 and 2012, the population of Latinos in this region, the metropolitan area, grew by 150%. And Latinos account for most of the immigration in the U.S., and they're responsible for the population growth that's going on in the U.S. now. And in many places, they're responsible for the continued vitality of regions, or of small suburban places, or of rural places. So if you project out the new majority will comprise, as you said, 96% of all new growth by 2040. The new majority will go from 22% of the population in 2010 to about 37% in 2040. So that's part of the picture, that we're going to have a larger minority. The other part of the picture is that according to the American Community Survey, 44% of renter households were cost burdened in our metropolitan area, compared to something like 10 or 15% of homeowners. And so if we're going to have even more renters that are going to be in this market, we have to make sure to meet that demand. And can we meet that demand just by building or by renovating? Or will the price of rental housing go up in response to all this? Third piece of this is that the Harvard's Equality of Opportunity Project recently linked the Columbus commuting zone, which is the area around Columbus that we share economic relationships with, 87th with regard to upward mobility. And the probability that the bottom fifth of the population, that's 87th among the top 100 metropolitan commute zones by size in the United States. The odds of reaching someone who's born living in the bottom fifth, getting up to the top fifth in Columbus, is about 4%. And this suggests that there's some aggressive action that we need to take. When you look at Columbus's metropolitan region in terms of where people who are more well-off live versus people who have less money, where people who are white live versus people who are more diverse live, we have a very segregated landscape in Columbus. And for us to have a region that is prosperous in 2040, we need to deal with these fair housing issues that we have. We need to deal with our landscape so that we have equitable opportunity up until that time. Thank you.
Well, Rachel, you make some very good points. As somebody who works at Ohio Capital Corporation for Housing, which helps to create affordable housing and mostly multifamily overall, and I find that very interesting because it is very difficult to create those kinds of dense developments in areas where income tends to be higher. Chris, have you seen anything in your research that would point to us being able to resolve that because demand will be so high that people will be more than happy to live wherever they live, regardless of who lives next to them?
Oh, that's an interesting question. What I've seen in surveys is a growing preference among people to move into neighborhoods and communities that have a diversity of housing stock, and there's some good reasons for that, but also a diversity of the social stock, if you will. Communities comprised of older and younger households and households of different races and ethnicities. I've been tracking this trend for a long time, and about 20-some years ago, the number was something like 10% of American households would actually seek out those opportunities. The last survey I saw in 2013, it was up to about 40 to 45%. And the trend is clear. It's a straight line practically with all the surveys in between. So I think that there is a growing desirability to move into mixed housing stock and mixed social stock neighborhoods. It's probably not among the majority of the population yet, But as we move to more diverse populations, I see that maybe growing to become a majority in 20 or so years.
I'd be interested too, something we did talk about is, in order for suburbs, from what I hear you saying, in order for suburbs to be able to adapt, they also will need to develop where they can this kind of denser housing. There's a lot of tension in that in some of our suburbs, perceptions about who might be living there, perceptions about crime that comes with denser development, just because of what people have seen in the, in their lifetime, assuming that's what will happen. How would you address that?
Change is coming, and you either plan for change or it happens to you anyway. I think a lot of communities that I work with around the country recognize that change is coming, and they're adapting to the change that they see happening. Now, your region here is a weak region in terms of top-down planning and all this. You don't need to have top-down planning. I've seen states with top-down planning, and they, on many key metrics, they don't do much better than anybody else. But the real difference in successful regions is where the regional agency communicates the facts and the opportunities to the client communities. So for all of the suburban communities and counties, what do my results indicate or other data show in terms of the coming change in terms of households and race and ethnicity and age and everything else, and what are the implications for housing types and demands, and what are the implications if you don't meet your reasonable share of the change that's going to happen. Maybe you're going to be fine, or maybe you're going to fall behind in terms of housing value, job growth, and so forth. But it starts with the region having an open dialogue with data and insights with its client communities. I think that's already happening here, and I suspect it's going to get more and more. But on the housing side, too many suburban communities around the country, I don't know this area, so I can't speak about this area, but too many suburban communities around the country are in what I call the baby boom time warp. Housing dynamics that existed when I raised my family 20 years ago are presumed to go on forever. Well, I'm downsizing, people. I'm not going to be raising another family, and the baby boomers are going to be dominating your housing choices for much, if not all, of the metropolitan area here. But again, I think that's part of the dialogue that has to happen between the regional agency and the local governments.
Rachel, do you have any comments on any of that?
No, I think that it's important to think about how the dialogue happens across the region, and that I think there's one regional agreement among entering suburbs, right, to not poach employment. I think that's the thing. So I guess I'm wondering what kinds of public-private partnerships, what kinds of agreements, not only the information, but are there ways of really forming those cooperative relationships, and are they necessary, I guess, one question.
Around the country, I see a lot of what I would call single-purpose or functional agreements among local governments in their self-interest. And as a matter of fact, the Twin Cities metropolitan area that has its very unique but also very successful tax-based sharing program began as a conversation between older central cities and the younger burgeoning suburbs, because the younger burgeoning suburbs knew that they were on borrowed time, that in 20 years or 30 years, those then vibrant suburbs that were making all kinds of fancy new money and investments, they would be falling behind as their stock ages and development goes elsewhere. So through a partnership among the local governments, they got together and said, let's do it differently for us, for this region. Well, you'll do yours also differently. But I think it's probably case by case, issue by issue, what and where are the mutual interests advanced. And surprise, surprise, many times everybody benefits by collaborating in a certain respect, and you wouldn't know that until you sat down and started talking about this.
One of the things that I wonder about, we have suburbs on the outer ring, tend to have higher income, more resources. We have suburbs, though, who are close in to the core of Columbus. who were developed, bungalows, our Whitehall, Reynoldsburg, areas that developed through the 50s, through the 70s, and may not necessarily have the resources to redevelop. But what would you suggest for those suburbs? They are close in. Whitehall, for example, is rather close to the core downtown, so perhaps that's a positive.
I think that what I see, again, I don't know this area, what I see elsewhere for the closer in older suburbs is that, for one thing, it's hands off on the housing stock. You're not going to be successful in this redevelopment business if you threaten neighbors with tearing down their own homes or their own neighborhoods. But you don't want to do that anyway. You want to keep that stock. So work with the neighbors and say, no, we want to actually have your neighborhood flourish by advancing economic development along the main street or along the commercial corridor, or maybe in that infill site that is vacant, that is a parking lot or is a burned down building, whatever it is. But redevelopment is vastly more complex than greenfield development. We all know that. I've seen the numbers. I've seen the time frames. You can do something in a fraction of the time on a farm than in a redeveloped commercial corridor. But I've also seen situations where public-private partnerships can be formed and sustained to drop in, gather the tools that are available, and make change in a very short period of time, relatively short anyway by historical standards. And the private sector, the trick is to find the public sector tools, including zoning tools, but also some financial tools. Find the mix of public sector tools that can maximize or leverage the private sector investment in the shortest amount of time possible, and also having the public sector perhaps pick up part of the investment risk. And so there's an area called patient capital that is being bandied about. And so one role for the public sector is to provide a patient capital role to leverage the private sector investment. But the one thing you want to do is maximize the private sector investment, because that's where it all happens.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Rachel? No.
I think you said it all.
He said it all. Why don't we focus a little bit more in on the city? It's the city of Columbus. We have several abandoned properties, quite a bit of abandoned properties inside the city of Columbus. Is this something that will solve those problems or not?
Every city of this age and size has a large supply of abandoned buildings. Some of those ought to be acquired through tax foreclosure, if that's a possibility. Others might be acquired through public devices. But mostly, again, I think here's an opportunity for public-private partnerships to take place. There's a redevelopment of an old, I think it's a Sears distributing warehouse in Memphis called Crossroads or something. It was owned by the private sector. The public sector came in. They packaged some financing around, and now it's being converted. This is like a 1.1 million square foot building that was abandoned. It's being converted now into a mix of offices and residential and some retail and so forth. It takes some creativity. It takes some willpower and some elbow grease, but these things can be done. But I think that I want to touch on something else that you might not be acquainted with. I do a lot of demographic analysis. I study a lot of cities from afar. Even though this is my second time to Columbus, I knew a lot about you before coming here. Some good, some bad. But the one thing I've learned in all my analysis is that outside of New York City, every U.S. metropolitan area has an inherent market demand for 1% to 2% of the total metropolitan population to live downtown. You could go anywhere, Vidalia, Georgia, or Atlanta, Georgia, or Salt Lake City. 1 to 1.5% of the total region's population. That's not a lot. 99% don't want to live downtown. But 1% of this region means 20,000 people want to live in downtown Columbus if they had an opportunity. This is low-hanging fruit. And maybe some of those abandoned buildings could become opportunities for that kind of market.
What do you think about those abandoned homes that are within the neighborhoods adjacent to the downtown? Is that going to solve their problem, or no?
These require sort of tailored responses. It may very well be that some abandoned homes in some neighborhoods in the city, or anywhere else for that matter, ought to be acquired by a public sector and simply torn down. Flint, Michigan was awash with abandoned homes 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It used tax foreclosures and other mechanisms to buy up the abandoned homes, and they tore them down. And they made green spaces out of them. But what they really did is they right-sized the market. So no longer is the Flint, Michigan market awash with empty homes. There's now a balance, a reasonable balance between supply and demand. And home values have stopped going down. In fact, they're going up a little bit. So, but every place is different. You'd have to sort of analyze what the opportunities are and what the challenges are here and elsewhere around the metropolitan area. But it may very well be that you have an acquisition and demolition strategy in certain cases.
One of the things that we were talking about this last night, and I was wondering about this question of the teardowns, because I know Detroit has done this too, where you tear down a building and someone takes over the yard. So now they have someone doesn't necessarily own the land next to them, but they get to use it as open space. And that it may be owned by the city may sell it to them for $1. And I think there's some of that going on right now with our two land banks in Franklin County and Columbus. So what I think about, though, is the balance between and so when you're tearing down these buildings, you're reducing your density. And what's the balance over time? When do you start seeing these become redeveloped and you start regaining density again in the areas that we already have neighborhoods? That's kind of what I've been thinking about.
These things are cyclical. A building will last 20 to 40 to 50 years, and it'll run its course if it's a non-residential building. Sometimes it's better off to not do anything with it. An investor might come in later and rehabilitate it, or sometimes it has to be torn down. I think of the long term. Any given year, you're going to have opportunities that you miss, or maybe seize opportunities. But here's something a little off the chart, too. If the local government is actively engaged in acquiring these properties, for whatever reason, when they become redeveloped by the private sector or public-private partnerships, I always recommend the public entities retain land ownership. Even if the land lease back to the private sector is pennies on the dollar, it becomes a long-term endowment in resources back to the local government. And in 10 years, it'll be negligible. But in 100 years, the mayor of Columbus 100 years from now will praise the leaders today for thinking about creating an endowment for future taxpayers of the city, and then using the future land base to leverage the private sector investment. And by the way, for the non-residential stock, it's my perception, and I don't know this economy here, but it's my perception that private sector investment is more likely to come when land costs are low, and it doesn't matter who owns the land. If the land leaseback is very favorable, the private sector is leveraged. After all, land is 20 to 40% typically of the total development cost. If you take the land cost off the table and convert it into a land lease for pennies on the dollar, you get that private investment, you get that economic activity, you get the collateral activity around the neighborhood. A lot of good things happen. And then when that building runs its course in 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years, the land is recycled by the landowner, the city or the public sector, as the continuing endowment.
You've looked at these trends over up to 2040, and what I'm interested in, you've said, these things are cyclical, and yes, they are, but I think something we would want to know, since we're seeing a rush to develop quite a lot of multifamily housing, certainly in the downtown area. We know that there's a need for affordable housing. I mean, we've made that point earlier in this conversation, and we will be doing that. But what I'm interested in is, what are you thinking about beyond 2040? Are these long-term trends? Are this just a short-term trend for these kinds of preferences? What should we expect after that?
There's a lot of catching up around the country. The numbers of units permitted for multifamily housing is the highest, I think, ever in history for the U.S. But I also see in some metropolitan areas the danger that even though I say, you know, most of the new demand is for rental housing, you can overdo that too. I see a lot of thoughtful developers pulling back a little bit on their apartment investment, apartment construction, because they don't want to overdo it. And of course, they usually end up owning the building anyway, so they don't want to end up owning something that's not renting out favorably. But I want to, you know, I've talked about the long term, but let me talk about something in the interim. A lot of people think, well, let's build or support that fancy 10, 15, 20 floor residential tower, and it looks pretty and makes us feel good and everything else. That's very expensive. You're putting in elevator shafts, you have to do steel reinforced concrete, maybe seismically controlled. I don't know what the seismic situation is around here. But your cost per square foot for steel frame construction is a lot higher than wood frame construction. So what I see a lot happening in my part of the country, the Intermountain West, is the middle ground. There's a lot of 4-floor and 5-floor wood frame construction buildings going on, the concrete podiums and you have parking underneath or maybe parking in some stores underneath, but the structure is mostly wood frame, and so you save 20 to 35% per square foot cost. And if you're saving that amount of money, you actually have a product that becomes more affordable as a consequence. And you're still getting 60 to 70 units per acre when you do it right, maybe even higher than that if you do your design right. And you still have adequate parking if you have the building in the right location, maybe with BRT access or downtown access. So I think there's a lot of advantages to thinking not so much about the gleaming high-rise residential towers in a few places, but having the lower-rise 3, 4, 5-floor wood frame construction residential in a lot more places. And oh, by the way, when you do that, you generate more, you spread out the economic activity more to generate more stores and more economic opportunity in more places around the city. So, and if anything, I would advance that strategy as a interim, maybe 50-year strategy, because maybe in 100 years, that particular site ought to be a high-rise residential tower. But you're not going to build that tower next year or the year after. You might build it in 2065. But in the meantime, maybe you can do a 3-floor, 4-floor residential project as the interim or successional land use.
I want to remind the audience that, of course, we will be having questions from you after this next question, so I hope you're all thinking of some very good questions. My final question to you, Chris, so what do you recommend to homeowners in the suburbs? What should they be doing now?
It depends on where you are. A lot of homeowners have a good sense of the long-term investment of their home, but I think this is where the regional agency could come in and say, you know, here are the trends, and you know, we are all consumers, and we're all very intelligent people. What we're missing is the information. So if we had information about how demographics were changing and how markets were changing, we could internalize that information and provide better judgments for ourselves about whether we should sell the home or buy the home or maybe rent the home out, whatever. But I would leave that to the individual to decide what they want to do, but they need the information, and a key role of the regional government would be to provide information that they might not otherwise have. But let's say you decided that you need to sell. Let's say that you are in a challenged suburban area, and some suburban areas are doing very well and will always do well. Others are not. Others will be always challenged, or you know, and in between. But let's say you need to sell, and let's say you can't sell because the market just isn't going to generate the money you think you need from the home to make it worth your while. You could super discount the home, of course, but maybe you can rent the home out. And that would be a strategy. Or maybe you could rent part of the home out and stay in the home, especially with a boomer coming on in years. The boomer doesn't want to leave the house. They want to age in place, but they don't want to take care of the place either. So maybe they want to rent part of the place out. We might have to rethink our zoning codes to allow more flexibility for people to rent their homes out or rent their homes, period, and things like this. So I think that we need to create opportunities for flexibility for everybody in the region, especially, I think, the suburban communities.
Well, as you know, it's CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please, if you have a question, go to the microphone and state your name and then ask your question. And we thank you in advance for holding long editorial comments. So why don't we start with our first question? Hello, Mr. Barbash.
Mark Barbash, and is that long editorial comment thing aimed directly at me? I'm with Finance Fund, and I want to jump the cycle a little bit, but first, 100 years from now, I suspect Mayor Coleman's going to be running for his 30th term as mayor. I represent that subset of Gen Xers who have of baby boomers. I'd love to be a Gen Xer. Of a baby boomers who have a Gen Xer in the family who lives away, but we can't move because 4 rooms in our house are filled with all of the stuff that she's left behind. And I want to raise the topic of education. I want to raise the topic of what happens in Columbus and elsewhere when those folks who are looking for more dense housing, more active housing, whether it's downtown or whether it's in suburban communities that are building denser, a piece of those millennials decide to have families. And they then have to make the same decision that people who are moving into Central Ohio now have to make, which is, where do I live to have a good school? And I'm interested in thoughts on how we take education in the public schools and move it into this discussion. And by the way, a factoid totally unrelated, by the way, in Northeast Ohio, they're thinking about industrial property. There is 4 times as much industrially zoned land in square feet that Northeast Ohio will ever be able to absorb. This is a very complex issue, but I'm interested in your thoughts on how we deal with this education issue in this context.
Well, as a professor, I have a 1-hour lecture on this, literally. I'll try to get to the main points. So one of my former students, I taught for some years at Georgia Tech, and I met with her on some airplane trip somewhere. She lives in Decatur, Georgia, which is this nice, older suburban town outside of Atlanta. She had 2 kids with her husband, and I said, oh, that means you're going to move to the good schools out in the suburbs. And she says, no, we've thought that through. She was then in her late 30s. She said, we're going to live into our 90s, if not longer. We're going to be together, husband and wife, for 60 years or more. We'll be spending only 20 years of that raising children. And the other 40 years, we want to live someplace that we want to live in, not necessarily near schools, because they wouldn't need schools. So they've decided to stay put where they were in Decatur, Georgia. And I said, well, what about the schools? She says, we'll fix the schools by creating a charter school under the Georgia laws. You can do charter schools. I don't know the laws here. And we will be with other parents driving the charter school educational process. So that is a solution. It's not the solution, but for certain situations, it may be a solution. But I want to also talk about the oversupply of commercial land, industrial land. What a great point. America is awash with overzoned retail, overzoned office, and overzoned industrial land. So much to the point where the value of that land is driven down so low because of the excess supply, and nothing else can happen because the zoning is not right. So Spokane, Washington fixed all that. They did a market study to figure out the real demand for commercial along one of its commercial corridors, estimated the pent-up demand for residential along the corridor, and then they changed the zoning to right-size the zoning to allow more of the residential and less of the retail and office, and suddenly things began happening. These are easy solutions.
Cleve Ricksecker, Short North resident with 2 kids in Columbus City schools that are having a wonderful experience, and you don't have to go out to the suburbs for the sake of the children. My question is, when you talk about but for Columbus, Ohio will be losing population, it makes me very sad because I think of places like Cincinnati and Cleveland have just incredibly beautiful, rich environments, and neighborhoods that are designed and built in such a way that you can never replicate them. Is there hope for these places?
There is hope. We're going to add 100 million people to this country between now and 2050, if not faster. And I think that a lot of these older places have a certain amount of charm built into them. I like Cincinnati. I don't know about you all, but you know, I enjoy visiting Cincinnati, and I could imagine myself living in Cincinnati. And by the way, I could imagine myself living here too. I haven't spent real time here until the past couple of days. But let me give you what's the term? The game changer. It's called climate change. So, cutting to the chase, between now and 2100, because of rising temperatures, 1 degree centigrade is what I hear these days, we'll see about a 1 meter rise, between a ½ meter and a 1 meter rise in sea level, and that'll inundate parts of the American coast. And so a lot of people have to relocate. But the main thing about climate change is that Cleveland, Ohio's winters in 2070 will be like they are in Memphis. And once you create a balmy, non-snowy, non-icy climate, and by the way, people need fresh water, and where do you have fresh water in Bandon? It's the Great Lakes. So I could see within some of your lifetimes the resurgence of some of these older Great Lakes cities because climate change makes them attractive. Now, climate change ruins the planet, of course, but it might make these places attractive.
Yes, my name is John McKnight, Columbus resident. I like Cincinnati. Columbus is better, so check us out. 2 questions for you. Is Columbus already doing anything right, doing anything as a community, municipality, towards preventing the blight that you sort of described? Secondly, have there been any other municipality that have put mandates in place for developers or created incentives for developers to redevelop existing land versus developing further and further out like they seem to be doing here? Thank you.
I can't tell you what Columbus is doing right because I don't know Columbus that well, but when I come here and see what's going on, my sense is you're doing an awful lot right, and it shows. I think it's also helpful that you have a major university here, Ohio State. You have the state government here. You have the collateral federal and state agencies here. You have major Fortune 500 companies here. You have the infrastructure. Maybe it's a matter of doing more with what you've already got than what you've already done already. But I don't know. Maybe you're doing just about what you should be doing. I'm very impressed with the downtown. I like what you're doing with the waterfront. I could see in 50 years to 100 years, maybe 10,000, 15,000 people living along both sides of the river. So that's an opportunity I think that you could begin planning for even right now. I forget what the other question was, but I'm not sure I could even answer that.
So I think I can answer the second question. Actually, I want to address the first one, and maybe Lisa can address the first question because you've actually been here the longest of anybody on this panel right now. That's true. But I think that we're doing well. We formed a Franklin County Land Bank last year. Yes, last year. We have a Columbus Land Bank that are going around and trying to figure out how to deal with these abandoned properties that we have. We have several grassroots organizations that are thinking about transit and transportation planning. We have a regional transportation plan that's being developed now. What else do we have? We have MORPC to keep us on our toes with regard to energy and environment, doing a lot of work there with local communities. We have communities that are being very proactive about what the future is. Dublin's plan is an example. I don't know about other communities. And we have OCCH, which I think is an incredible innovation nationally. I came here and I said, what? You have a syndicator that is nonprofit? What? So, which is for your tax credit program, that is. That's a very unusual thing. So I think lots of things are going well.
I would say as well, I do think that a lot is going well here. I think what has to go even better is that we are going to, through this funded study, we're going to see a lot of information, and it's true that every entity within Central Ohio will be able to see the information for their own local government for their own community. But what we really need to do even better is we're going to need to look at it as a region. And that is often difficult because people live in the community based on the kinds of things, the kinds of services they want, the kind of living that they want. But we've got to remember, when you think about Cincinnati, and I'm from Cleveland, so can I talk about Cleveland is great. But when you look at those communities, especially like a Cleveland, the reason why Cleveland has slowly become a donut hole is because of the inability to act regionally. And although they are working very hard to do that, it's better to do it before you become the donut hole. And Columbus has so much going for it that it's my opinion that if we cannot try to, at some level, act regionally, it doesn't matter what we have going for it, we'll waste it. So that would be my statement.
We're running short on time here. I'm going to try to get 2 questions in real quick. So lightning round, ready?
Both their questions, and then we will answer both of them.
All right. I'm Andrew Dodson. I'm a planning student at Ohio State. My question is about public transit. Specifically, well, 2 brief ones. The chicken and egg of density and public transit, and also the difference in preferences between the 2 main growing segments, the millennials and the baby boomers. Both are looking for density, but they have different preferences regarding public transportation. That's my, yeah.
I'm Justin Goodwin, planner with the City of Dublin. So the other side of the housing equation is the jobs question, right? So could you speak to changes or coming changes in business decisions, particularly business location decisions, within the context of these changing housing preferences and market demands?
Good questions, both. On the transit question, I would recommend that you start with low-hanging fruit. You know where your density already is. I would say also go with the least costly technology that still gives you the delivery that you want. And so in the past couple of years, I've actually become quite a proponent of bus rapid transit. I guess you're already doing that or starting to do that here. I would say we actually have a national study going on now to try to figure out whether the economic returns for BRT depend on the kind of BRT technology. Unlike light rail, unlike trolley, you have rail and you have stations. But BRT can either be in a dedicated lane or signalized intersections or their podium stops or whatever it is. There's all kinds of variations, or specially designed buses. So what we want to find out over the next year is whether the design and choice of technology makes a difference in how the market responds to these investments along the BRT lines. My suspicion is that if you do BRT right, and I think by doing it right you have dedicated lanes, clearly marked, or clearly, and you have signalization and prioritization for the buses and so on and so forth, that you will get the kind of return that you're hoping for from the market. On the density issue with, yes, the millennials and the baby boomers want more density, but they want different density. I'm not so sure that that's entirely the case. I should have a conversation separately about that. But let me talk about the jobs part that was raised for the City of Dublin and others. I know for a fact that most jobs in this metropolitan area are not downtown. The downtown probably accounts for 10% of all the jobs, maybe a little more, because you have the state capital and everything else. Most jobs are not in real places. They are in areas. But from what I know about job location, and I sit on the Economic Development Council for the state of Utah, firms moving into any state look for quality communities to move into. And quality communities to them appear to be housing mix, good schools, of course, good infrastructure, and increasingly good public transportation, not buses, but the BRT or the light rail or the trolley, because they also know that their workforce is becoming more and more astute to wanting more things out of their suburban communities. When I grew up, my mother and father, and when I raised my children, my child, You know, schools was basically it, parks was okay, you know. But now we see the next generation of home buyers or renters or whatever wanting those things and transit and walkability to coffee shops and this and that. And so the successfully competitive suburban communities in the future are having to retool themselves to provide these more urbane opportunities in a suburban setting. And I think, you know, places like Dublin are probably figuring this out.
And if what Rachel's saying is true, if in a freshman class, one person said they would want to own a car, that's the future workforce, people. They want to live where they can work.
I got to stop you there.
Because you don't believe that?
I don't, you know, I've taught school for 30 years now. And I've taught undergrads and grads and doctoral students and postdoctoral students and professional students. What a freshman says today.
True, since I have 2 of those in college, I'm going to hold on to that thought. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's forum. Remember that you can see it again on Columbus TV3, on the Ohio channel on WOSU, and share it on YouTube through CMC's website. We encourage you to continue the conversation in our lobby over coffee and cookies. We'd also like to invite you to come back to CMC frequently. Before we leave, once more, let's thank our partners from MORPC and our speakers, Dr. Chris Nelson, Rachel Kleit, and Lisa Patt-McDaniel. And thank you for being here. We look forward to seeing you again at CMC.